of this essay has been criticized by post-structural feminists for being too essentialistic in some of its ideas. But some very important ideas of feminist literary history and feminist literary criticism are presented by Elaine Showalter as a part of this essay. So, as I already mentioned, this is a much longer essay, and I will put up the longer essay in your Google Classroom if anybody wishes to go through it quickly. But you have a very abridged version of that essay to study. So the longer essay actually begins with a discussion about what are some of the problems faced by feminist criticism. She begins by talking about two specific problems. One is that generally male literary critics or non-feminist literary critics are, they tend to look at feminism as being too rigid. And the idea that feminists always talk about the same kind of issues. So that is a problem, and that kind of so people tend to dismiss feminism or feminist literary criticism, thinking that feminism always talks about the same kind of problems and asks the same questions of texts. And this, she says, is because there is no clarity regarding feminist literary theory. So feminist literary theory, unlike other literary theories that existed at that time, was not clear enough. It didn't have enough of a structure that people could accept it as a proper literary theory. So that was one problem. And another problem was that, she said, feminist literary theory or feminist literary criticism comes from feminist activism, and activists generally have been suspicious of theory. So there is an idea that activism, going down into society and working for the welfare of women, working for the rights of women, etc., that is more important than theorizing or conceptualizing about the how do I say, literary works and things like that. So there was an idea like that even among many feminists, and because of that, feminist critics did not really put a lot of effort into building up feminist literary theory. These were some of the problems faced by feminist literary criticism during the 1970s. So after that, she is now going to talk about her proposed methods of studying literature from a feminist perspective. And that is what we are going to look at. So now we will start reading the essay, or at least a section that you have to study. Feminist criticism can be divided into two distinct varieties. The first type is concerned with woman as reader, with woman as the consumer of male-produced literature, and with the way in which the hypothesis of a female reader changes our apprehension of a given text, awakening us to the significance of its sexual codes. I shall call this kind of analysis the feminist critique, and like other kinds of critique, it is a historically grounded inquiry which probes the ideological assumptions of literary phenomena. Its subjects include the images and stereotypes of women in literature, the omissions of and misconceptions about women in criticism, and the fissures in male-constructed literary history. It is also concerned with the exploitation and manipulation of the female audience, especially in popular culture and film, and with the analysis of woman as sign in semiotic systems. So, she's saying feminist criticism generally there are two distinct varieties in feminist criticism. This is again something that Showalter is proposing. So she's looking at the different ways in which feminists have studied literature so far, and she's dividing them all into two distinct varieties. And the first type, she says, that is concerned with woman as reader, woman as the consumer of male-produced literature. So you look at all the great canonical works by the important authors, the canonical authors from Chaucer, Shakespeare onwards. So most of the great authors are considered to be men. Literary history we always know that we see age of Shakespeare, age of Chaucer, age of Milton, അങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മൾ പറയുക, age of Tennyson, age of Wordsworth. So always literary history itself is built around the image of certain great men, male writers. And the canonical works always are full of writings by male writers, and there will be one or two, a few token representations of female writers, like Emily Dickinson or the Bronte sisters or George Eliot or people like that. So generally, we always get this impression if we look at a typical literary history of English literature, that it is only in the 19th century that women started writing, as if women did not write before that. So that is a kind of a wrong idea that we get. So because, however, she says that it is important to read these kind of male-produced literature from the perspective of a woman. And അങ്ങനെ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ എന്തൊക്കെയാണ് ഈ woman as reader എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ, what are the things that we look at? The way in which the hypothesis of a female reader changes our apprehension of a given text. ഒരു ടെക്സ്റ്റ് എടുത്താൽ, ഒരു മെയിൽ പ്രൊഡ്യൂസ്ഡ് ടെക്സ്റ്റ് എടുത്താൽ, അത് it is assumed that a man wrote it for other men. But what if you change the assumption? What if you bring in the hypothesis of a female reader? How does a female reader read this text? അപ്പോൾ ഒരേ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് തന്നെ ഒരു മെയിൽ റീഡർ വായിക്കുമ്പോൾ കാണുന്ന അതേ കണ്ണുകളിൽ കൂടെയാണോ ഒരു ഫീമെയിൽ റീഡർ കാണുന്നത്? Does the female reader see any problem in the text, or does the female reader get a different perspective about this text? This kind of reading all of you will be familiar with. By now നമുക്ക് വളരെ familiar ആയിട്ടുള്ളതാണ്, and many people actually engage in this kind of feminist criticism, where you take any particular author's works and then you look at it from a woman's perspective or from a feminist perspective. So how does looking at a text from the perspective of a female reader change our apprehension, our comprehension, our understanding of a given text? And how does it awaken us? How does it make us understand the significance or the importance of its sexual codes? Sexual codes in the sense that a lot of things in the text will be coded in a particular way that privileges the male sex over the female sex. And how do we understand those things? So that is the idea of the first type of feminist criticism, which is concerned with woman as reader. And please note this, she gives a name to this kind of criticism, this variety of criticism, which is the feminist critique. I shall call this kind of analysis the feminist critique. And then she also defines what she means by critique. Like other kinds of critique, it is a historically grounded inquiry. So critique in the varana, it is a historically grounded inquiry which probes, which studies the ideological assumptions of literary phenomena. So literary phenomena can mean not just literary text, but also, the building up of a cult around an author, the idea of certain groups of authors. Like, for example, the lake poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Sadi, they are called the lake poets in the Romantic period. So like that, there are many literary phenomena, and usually in normal literary history, in canonical literary history, we do not question these kind of literary phenomena. But the feminist critique is a kind of ideological criticism. It critiques the ideological assumptions behind literary phenomena in a historically grounded manner. So all critiques are like that. Critique basically means a historically grounded inquiry probing the ideological assumptions of literary phenomena. Like that, feminist critiques does this from a feminist point of view. And what are the subjects? What do you study in that? What are the topics that you study in that? Its subjects include, first of all, the images and stereotypes of women in literature. That is very common. We know that by now. You look at Shakespeare's images of women, or images of women in some other poet, like that. So what kind of stereotypical images are used in the writings of these great writers, and what are the kind of wrong representations of, incorrect representations of women, and what kind of ideological role does that play? That is a very that's a very first and most basic subject of feminist critique. Then secondly, the omissions of and misconceptions about women in criticism. So generally criticism, even a lot of criticism has been male produced. If you look at if you look at critical theory, except for a set of critics whom we call feminist critics, most of the great critics, so-called great critics, are all men. So if you look at the criticism by men, criticism by male critics, how do they omit references to women? How do they omit or how do they exclude women from their criticism? And what kind of misconceptions, wrong understandings about women do they have in their study of these canonical texts? Thirdly, the fissures in male constructed literary history. So again, the idea that literary history, canonical literary history, is male constructed, it is produced by men, and therefore it privileges men to the exclusion of women. So what are the fissures, or what are the fragments, or what are the gaps in that literary history, the canonical literary history, and how do we understand women's position in literary history? These three are the most important or most basic subjects or topics that are covered by feminist critique. Also, apart from that, it is concerned with the exploitation and manipulation of the female audience, especially in popular literature and popular culture and popular film. So the female audience, how are they manipulated into liking certain sexist jokes in films, or what we call item songs and different things like that. So basically there are a lot of things in popular culture, in popular cinema, and in popular literature which are actually sexist or which are patriarchal, but somehow the female readership or the female audience of popular culture are manipulated into liking or supporting or approving of these things. How does that happen? That process is also something that is questioned by the feminist critique. These are, again, I am telling you the assumptions behind feminist critique, and this is actually some of these assumptions have been challenged by later feminists. Anyway, and finally, it is also concerned with the analysis of woman as sign in semiotic systems. Semiotics, as you must have studied, is the study of signs, right? So signs, symbols, etc. So how does woman function as a sign or as a symbol in many of these, many of these canonical literary works, or even works of popular culture? What are the meanings associated with woman? For example, if you look at this in Indian cinema, if you look at this film called Mother India, so there is this idea, there is this ideological conflation of the woman with mother and with nation, and this is something that you can see in many different works. So a woman, what does a woman stand for in a text or in a narrative? So these are also some of the things that are studied. I'm not going into greater detail about this because I think you guys must be already familiar with many such critical readings. So this is the first distinct variety of feminist criticism presented by Elaine Showalter, and it is called feminist critique. It deals with woman as reader. I hope this is clear. Now, the second type of feminist criticism is concerned with woman as writer, with woman as the producer of textual meaning, with the history, themes, genres, and structures of literature by women. Its subjects include the trajectory of the individual, its subjects include the psychodynamics of female creativity, Linguistics and the problem of a female language, the trajectory of the individual or collective female literary career, literary history, and of course, studies of particular writers and works. No term exists in English for such a specialized discourse, and so I have adapted the French term la gynocritique into the English term that she is coining, gynocritics. It is there is some spelling mistake here. It is actually gynocritics, gynocritics. Although the significance of the male pseudonym in the history of women's writing also suggested the term Georgics. So this is the second type of feminist criticism that she mentions. And if the first type, feminist critique, was concerned with woman as reader, the second type is concerned with woman as writer. And the name that she designates for this is gynocritics. She says it is from a French term, la gynocritique. So what does gynocritics mean? In some scholars also call this gynocriticism. But gynocritics is the term that is used by Showalter in this essay. Okay, so what is this concerned with? It is concerned with woman as writer. That means woman as the producer of textual meaning, with the history, themes, genres, and structures of literature by women. ആദ്യം പറഞ്ഞ feminist critique male produced literature, male produced literary criticism, male produced literary history, ഒരു ഫെമിനിസ്റ്റ് പോയിന്റ് ഓഫ് വ്യൂവിൽ നിന്ന്, ഒരു സ്ത്രീയുടെ വുമൺസ് പെർസ്പെക്റ്റീവിൽ നിന്ന് ക്രിട്ടിക്ക് ചെയ്യാം, ക്രിട്ടിക്കലി റീഡിങ് ആയിരുന്നു. ബട്ട് ഗൈനോക്രിറ്റിക്സിന്റെ ഇൻട്രസ്റ്റ് എന്താണ്? ഇറ്റ് ഇസ് ടു ലുക്ക് അറ്റ് വുമൺ ആസ് റൈറ്റർ, to look at woman as the producer of textual meaning. So what about the writings, the literature that is written by women? What kind of writings are they? What is the history of women's writing? What are the important themes that we can see commonly in women's writing? The genres in which women write, the structures through which, the structures of these texts. So these are the things that are studied by gynocritics. And its subjects include the psychodynamics of female creativity. So first of all, the psychodynamics, what is female creativity? So psychologically understanding or psychoanalytically understanding the creativity of women. Then linguistics and the problem of a female language. So there is always this question of, I think, have you, I don't know whether you have studied this Virginia Woolf's essay, I think it is Room of One's Own or Shakespeare's Sister, I don't remember which one. One of the essays in which Virginia Woolf talks about how language itself is sexed, that there are certain kind of sentence structures or certain kind of writings that you associate with, which you can call a male sentence, certain kinds which can be called a female sentence, and certain kinds which can be called an androgynous writing. And she even looks at the canonical male writers and she says that, different, Wordsworth wrote in a masculine fashion, Keats wrote in a feminine fashion, Shelley wrote in a sexless fashion, and Shakespeare wrote in an androgynous fashion. So those kind of ideas are there. So similarly, she is also saying, is there a female language? Is there a particular kind of usage of language that is specific to women writers? And so analyzing language through linguistics, but not from a general perspective, from this idea of trying to understand the structure of language which is used specifically by women. That is a second subject of gynocritics. And the third one, the trajectory of the individual or collective female literary career. So, like I said earlier, there are the great writers of canonical literature are generally considered to be men. So then how do we unearth a canon of female writers? What is the life and career of each individual female writer? Similarly, just like the lake poets, for example, which we already mentioned in canonical literature, are there such collectives of women writing together, sharing their work, discussing with each other, or being inspired by one another? Are there such collective female literary careers? So these also the trajectory of the individual or collective female literary career. Then literary history, as I mentioned earlier, traditional literary history is male produced and it privileges men. So how do we come up with a female literary history or a literary history from the perspective of women, and highlighting the position of women within literary history? And of course, studies of particular writers and their works, particular female writers and their works. These are the subjects that come under gynocritics, which is the second type of feminist criticism. It is concerned with women as writers. So I hope this is clear. This is one of the most important points in her essay. The two distinct varieties of feminist criticism: feminist critique and gynocritics. Feminist critique deals with women as reader of male produced literature and what are the different things that they do. Gynocritics deals with women as writer and what are the different kind of critical subjects that they analyze. Okay, and there is a kind of parenthetical statement that she makes, which is not very important, but she says gynocritics is the word that she chooses, and this is by adapting a French term, la gynocritique, and because gyno means related to women, la gynocritique. But she says that in the history of women's writing, it has been characterized by preponderance of the male pseudonym. A lot of women writers, including the most important being George Eliot, have actually used male pseudonyms. All the Bronte sisters initially used male pseudonyms. So because of that, and because George Eliot was the most important one among them, she also considered using the term Georgics in order to talk about gynocritics. But she decided against that, and she has used the term gynocritics. Now, what is the difference between these two? The feminist critique is essentially political and polemical, with theoretical affiliations to Marxist sociology and aesthetics. Gynocritics is more self-contained and experimental, with connections to other modes of new feminist research. So this is the important difference between the two. The feminist critique is political and polemical. That means they're just by looking at men's writing from a feminist point of view, the important idea is political, which means that you want to question the ideology behind that writing. So it is political. It is polemical because you are less interested in the nuances of writing and more interested in making a point, making an ideological point or making a political point. So polemical means polemical comes from the word pole, North Pole, South Pole, like that, pole, two poles. So polemical studies, actually, or polemical critiques will not look at nuances, rather they will hold extreme positions. So because of that, feminist critique is essentially political and therefore it is also polemical. And its theoretical affiliations are to Marxist sociology and aesthetics. It is indebted to Marxist literary criticism, Marxist sociology, Marxist theory, etc. Gynocritics, on the other hand, is more self-contained because it is women trying to understand the writings of women. So they are more interested in the nuances of women's writings. It is experimental. It is because there is there has not been any way of looking at women's writings by women, rather than in comparison to male writers. Because of that, it is much more experimental, and it is connected to other modes of new feminist research, including maybe eco-criticism and other things like that. So it is more of a horizontal way of looking at, drawing on different resources related to feminism and trying to understand literary texts that are produced by women. That's the difference between these two. Jane, is the next sentence in your textbook in a dialogue between these two positions?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
No, ma'am. That's not that.
Yeah, can you tell me which is the next?
Next one is, as we see in this analysis, one of the problems of the feminist critique is that it is male-oriented.
Okay, so because she says, as we see in this analysis, and we don't see any analysis in your textbook. Actually, there is an example of a feminist critique that she gives in the original essay, which is about Thomas Hardy's novel, Mayor of Casterbridge. So you can read that on your own later if you like. Yeah, this one, right, as we see in this analysis. Okay. So she is doing a feminist critique, or rather she is giving an example of how feminist critique works by looking at Thomas Hardy's novel, Mayor of Casterbridge. And then she is talking about the problem of this feminist critique. As we see in this analysis, one of the problems of the feminist critique is that it is male-oriented. If we study stereotypes of women, the sexism of male critics, and the limited roles that women play in literary history, we are not learning what women have felt and experienced, but only what men have thought women should be. This is again important. It is the limitation of the feminist critique. Feminist critique in the problem endana. Karanam adu male oriented aanu. Male produced literary texts aanu nammal study cheynathu. Avar engane sexist ആയി പെരുമാറുന്നു, അവർ എങ്ങനെ സ്റ്റീരിയോടിപ്പിക്കൽ ആയിട്ട് സ്ത്രീകളെ പ്രസന്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു, അതുപോലെ മെയിൽ ക്രിറ്റിക്സ് എങ്ങനെ സെക്സിസ്റ്റ് ആയി പെരുമാറുന്നു, ലിറ്റററി ഹിസ്റ്ററിയിൽ ഹൗ വിമൻ ആർ ലിമിറ്റഡ് ഫ്രം ദാറ്റ് എന്നൊക്കെ നമ്മൾ അത് മാത്രം സ്റ്റഡി ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ വി ആർ ഓൺലി അണ്ടർസ്റ്റാൻഡിങ് ഓർ വി ആർ ഓൺലി ലേണിംഗ് വാട്ട് മെൻ ഹാവ് തോട്ട് അബൌട്ട് വിമൻ. How men see women എന്ന് മാത്രമേ നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നുള്ളൂ. We are not learning what women have felt and experienced. So at each point of literary history, what did women actually feel? What did they want to express? How did they communicate to other women? ഇതൊന്നും നമ്മൾ പഠിക്കുന്നില്ല. This is one of the problems of feminist critique. It is male-oriented. And the second problem she mentions is that in some fields of specialization, this may require a long apprenticeship to the male theoretician, whether he be Althusser, Barth, Macquarie, or Lacan, and then an application of the theory of science or myths or the unconscious to male texts or films. Again, ഈ ഫെമിനിസ്റ്റ് ക്രിറ്റീക്ക് എന്ത് ചെയ്യുന്നു എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ മാർക്സിസ്റ്റ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സെമിയോട്ടിക്സ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സൈക്കോ അനലിറ്റിക് ക്രിറ്റിസിസം ആണ് യൂസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. സോ ബേസിക്കലി ദ ഗ്രേറ്റ് ഫിഗേഴ്സ് ഓഫ് ദീസ് type of critical theories or these type of theoretical frameworks are also male, and you have to study, you have to become like an apprentice to the male theoretician. അത് മാർക്സ് ആയാലും അൽത്തൂസർ ആയാലും ബാർത്ത് ആയാലും ലക്കാൻ ആയാലും ശരി, അവർ പറഞ്ഞത് ആദ്യം മനസ്സിലാക്കുക, എന്നിട്ട് അവരുടെ തിയറി, അത് സയൻസിന്റെ തിയറി ആവാം, മിത്തിന്റെ തിയറി ആവാം, അൺകോൺഷ്യസിന്റെ ആവാം, ക്ലാസിന്റെ ആവാം, വോട്ട് എവർ, അവരുടെ തിയറി എടുത്തിട്ട് male produced text name, films name study cheya. But ultimately she says, what is the point of doing this? Because we know that male produced text will not have a proper representation of women. We know that they will have stereotypes. We know that they will always try to exclude women from literary criticism and from literary history. So once you establish that, then there is not really much that you're doing here. You are not understanding what women have felt and experienced, and you are spending a lot of your energy, your intellectual energy, in learning some of these theoretical frameworks only to apply them to these male texts or films. The temporal and intellectual investment one makes in such a process increases resistance to questioning it and to seeing its historical and ideological boundaries. So this is a related problem. So you spend so much time, temporal related to time. So you invest so much of your time in learning these kind of theories, and you also invest a lot of intellectual effort into it. Then what happens is that later you cannot question these theories, because these theories themselves are also male produced and from a male perspective. So you will not feel like criticizing that theory because you spend so much time and effort, intellectual effort, learning that theory. So then you will have a resistance to questioning such male produced theories like Marxism, psychoanalysis, etc., etc. And to seeing its historical and ideological boundaries. So you will understand that, okay, Marxism has a point, psychoanalysis has a point. ഇതിനൊന്നും നമ്മൾ കംപ്ലീറ്റ്ലി ഡിസ്മിസ് ചെയ്യണം എന്നല്ല പറയുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ ഇതെല്ലാം ഹിസ്റ്റോറിക്കൽ ആയ ചില ബൗണ്ടറീസ് അതിനുണ്ട്. ചില ഹിസ്റ്റോറിക്കൽ ജങ്ക്ചേഴ്സിൽ, ചില ഹിസ്റ്റോറിക്കൽ ആയിട്ടുള്ള നിമിഷങ്ങളിൽ ഉണ്ടായി വരുന്നതാണ്. അതിൻ്റെതായിട്ടുള്ള ചില റീസൺസ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അപ്പൊ വിത്തിൻ ദോസ് historical boundaries that particular theory might work, but sometimes you have to move beyond that theory. You have to critically analyze that theory itself, and this is something that you will not feel like doing if you have spent a lot of time and effort understanding that theory. Now, of course, it is in order to critique a theory, you need to understand it as well. That's a different point. That is something that she doesn't mention. But she's saying, she's assuming that feminist critics who invest their time and energy in apprenticeship to the male theoretician will be less likely to critique the male-produced theoretical framework as well. And this critique also, that is feminist critique, also has a tendency to naturalize women's victimization by making it the inevitable and obsessive topic of discussion. So another problem which feminism പറ്റി പൊതുവെ ആളുകൾ പറയുന്ന ഒരു ക്രിറ്റിസിസം തന്നെയാണ്, എപ്പോഴും സ്ത്രീകളെ മോശമായി റെപ്രസെന്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സ്ത്രീകളെ എക്സ്ക്ലൂഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നു എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ പറഞ്ഞ് അൾട്ടിമേറ്റ്ലി എന്തുണ്ടാവും, നമ്മൾ women as victims എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ മാത്രം നമ്മൾ അവരെ കാണാൻ തുടങ്ങും. So you only talk about the victimization of women, and if you keep talking about it, then it will seem like a natural thing, that it is very natural for women to be victims എന്ന് നമുക്ക് തോന്നില്ല. ഈ ലോകത്തെ സ്ത്രീകൾക്ക് ഏജൻസി ഒന്നുമില്ല, അവരായിട്ടൊന്നും ചിന്തിക്കുന്നില്ല, അവരായിട്ടൊന്നും ചെയ്യുന്നില്ല, അവരെ പുരുഷന്മാർ അവരെ മോശമായി റെപ്രസെന്റ് ചെയ്യുന്ന മാത്രമേ ഉള്ളൂ എന്ന് നമുക്ക് തോന്നാൻ സാധ്യതയുണ്ട്. These are the problems of the feminist critique. So she has mentioned two varieties of feminist criticism, feminist critique and gynocritics. She has explained what the two are about, and she has also pointed out the problems with the feminist critique. And now she is going to offer us gynocritics as an alternative. Idillalo Jane, one sees more over yellow. Yeah, what is the next line?
In contrast to this angry or loving fixation on male.
Okay, thank you. So now she is proposing gynocritics as the answer or as the solution to this. Before that, ഇത്രയും പറഞ്ഞത് ക്ലിയർ ആണോ നിങ്ങൾക്ക്?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So if you have any doubts or questions about it, you can type in the chat box, and then after talking a little bit about gynocritics, we will try to look at that. Okay, so I will continue now. Gynocritics. In contrast to this angry or loving fixation on male literature, the program of gynocritics is to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature, to develop new models based on the study of female experience rather than to adapt male models and theories. Gynocritics begins at the point when we free ourselves from the linear absolutes of male literary history, stop trying to fit women between the lines of the male tradition, and focus instead on the newly visible world of female culture. So, what does this mean? Feminist critique has a fixation on male-produced literature. It can be either an angry fixation or a loving fixation. So, നമ്മൾ male literature മാത്രം അതിന് the traditional way of engaging with male-produced literature is to unquestioningly accept it, lovingly accept it. അത് ഒരു പ്രോബ്ലം ആണ്, ബിക്കോസ് നമ്മൾ ട്രഡീഷണൽ ആയിട്ട് അങ്ങനെ ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ മെയിൽ പ്രൊഡ്യൂസ് ലിറ്ററേച്ചറിനെ മാത്രം അതിനെ അൺക്വസ്റ്റനിങ് ആയിട്ട് ആക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ അതിലുള്ള പ്രോബ്ലംസ് കാണുന്നില്ല, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വിമൻസ് എക്സ്ക്ലൂഷൻ നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നില്ല. അത് ലവിങ് ഫിക്സേഷൻ. വേറാസ് ഫെമിനിസ്റ്റ് ക്രിട്ടീക്കിനുള്ളത് ഒരു ആംഗ്രി ഫിക്സേഷൻ ആണ്. It is angry about how male literature represents women, but it is still fixated on male literature. So in contrast to that, അങ്ങനെ ചെയ്യുന്നതിൽ പകരം what is gynocritics offer us? The program of gynocritics, that is the agenda of gynocritics, is to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature. Women's literature മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ നമ്മൾ എന്താ പറയുക, so first of all, the texts that we are studying are women's texts written by women rather than male produced texts. So female produced texts are. Secondly, the theoretical framework also should not be just borrowed from some male produced theory like Marxism, psychoanalysis, post-structuralism, etc. Rather, we should come up with our own how do I say, new female frameworks or new feminist frameworks in order to analyze women's literature. So that is the first thing, first agenda of gynocritics, to develop new models based on the study of female experience, rather than to adapt male models and theories. So they explain how do you create this female theory or feminist theory? It should be based on female experience. If you adapt male models and male theories, then you may not be able to understand or appreciate women's writing, because what men സാധാരണ നമ്മൾ തിയറിയിൽ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ക്രിറ്റിസിസം നോക്കിയിട്ട് നമ്മൾ this is a good this is an example of good writing, something else is an example of bad writing എന്നൊക്കെ പറയുന്നത്, it is usually based on this kind of certain ideas of good and bad, whether in terms of linguistics, whether in terms of theory, etc., that are produced by men based on men's experiences, but that is shown as a universal experience. Instead, if you look at female experience and drawing on that female experience, we come up with ideas of how to analyze women's literature. So basically, we should create new female theories or feminist theories using women's experience in order to analyze women's literature. Gynocritics begins at the point when we free ourselves from the linear absolutes of male literary history. So male literary history, അങ്ങനെ തന്നെ നമ്മൾ ആക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ട് അതാണ് അബ്സൊല്യൂട്ട്, അതൊരു ലീനിയർ ഹിസ്റ്ററി ആണ്. ഇറ്റ് ബിഗിൻസ്, അതൊരു ക്രോണോളജിക്കൽ ഹിസ്റ്ററി ആണ്. ഏജ് ഓഫ് ചോസർ, ഏജ് ഓഫ് ഷേക്സ്പിയർ, ഏജ് ഓഫ് മിൽട്ടൺ, അങ്ങനെ ഏജ് ഓഫ് ഡ്രൈഡൻ, ഏജ് ഓഫ് വേർഡ്സ്വർത്ത്, ഏജ് ഓഫ് ടെനിസൺ, അങ്ങനെ അങ്ങനെ പറഞ്ഞു വരുന്നത് അതൊരു ലീനിയർ മോഡലാണ്. ആ ലീനിയർ മോഡലിനെ, അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു അബ്സല്യൂട്ട് നേച്ചറിനെ അതിൽ നിന്ന് നമ്മൾ ഫ്രീ ചെയ്യണം. We should stop trying to fit women between the lines of male tradition. അപ്പൊ ഈ ഒരു നമ്മൾ ഈ പറഞ്ഞ കനോണിക്കൽ ലിറ്റററി ഹിസ്റ്ററി എടുക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അതിലെവിടെ സ്ത്രീകളെ കൂട്ടിച്ചേർക്കാമെന്നാണ് നമ്മൾ നോക്കുക. അങ്ങനെയല്ല വേണ്ടത്. ഓൾറെഡി എക്സിസ്റ്റിംഗ് മെയിൽ ഹിസ്റ്ററിയിലേക്ക് സ്ത്രീകളെ കൂടി കുത്തി നിറയ്ക്കാൻ ശ്രമിക്കല്ല വേണ്ടത്. പകരം നമ്മൾ എന്ത് ചെയ്യണം? വി ഷുഡ് ഫോക്കസ് ഇൻസ്റ്റെഡ് ഓൺ ദ ന്യൂലി വിസിബിൾ വേൾഡ് ഓഫ് ഫീമെയിൽ കൾച്ചർ. സോ ഫീമെയിൽ കൾച്ചർ എടുക്കുക, കുറച്ചുകൂടി ഒരു ഹൊറിസോണ്ടൽ ആയിട്ട്, ഒരു ലീനിയർ ആയിട്ടല്ല, കുറച്ചുകൂടി സ്പ്രെഡ് ഔട്ട് ആയ രീതിയിൽ ഒരു കാലഘട്ടത്തിൽ ഒരു ഫീമെയിൽ റൈറ്റർ എടുക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അവരുടെ ചുറ്റുമുണ്ടായിരുന്ന മറ്റ് ഫീമെയിൽ റൈറ്റേഴ്സ് ആരാണ്, അവരുടെ മേലുള്ള ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് ആരാണ്, ബോത്ത് മെയിൽ ആൻഡ് ഫീമെയിൽ ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസുകൾ ആരൊക്കെയാണ്, ആ സമയത്ത് കൾച്ചറിൽ നടക്കുന്ന മറ്റു കാര്യങ്ങൾ, ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ മാത്രമല്ലാതെ വേറെന്തൊക്കെയാണ് അന്നത്തെ കൾച്ചറിൽ ഇമ്പോർട്ടൻ്റ് ആയ സംഭവങ്ങൾ, ഹൗ ഡിഡ് ദാറ്റ് ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് ദെയർ റൈറ്റിംഗ്, ആ രീതിയിൽ കുറച്ചുകൂടി ഒരു സ്പ്രെഡ് ഔട്ട് ആയിട്ടുള്ള രീതിയിൽ, ഒരു കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റുവൽ ആയിട്ടുള്ള രീതിയിൽ വിമൻസ് റൈറ്റിങ്ങിനെയും ഫീമെയിൽ കൾച്ചറിനെയും മനസ്സിലാക്കാം. സോ വി ആക്ച്വലി, ഇഫ് യു ലുക്ക് അറ്റ് ഇറ്റ് ദാറ്റ് വേ, റാദർ ദാൻ ഹാവിംഗ് ദിസ് ലീനിയർ ഹിസ്റ്ററി ഇൻ ടു വിച്ച് വി ആർ ട്രൈങ് ടു സ്ലോട്ട് വിമൻ, സോ ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് എ കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് ടോക്കണിസം. ഓൾറെഡി എക്സിസ്റ്റിംഗ് വലിയ വലിയ ആൾക്കാർ കുറെ നിൽക്കുന്ന അതിന്റെ ഇടയിലേക്ക് കുറെ സ്ത്രീകളെ കയറ്റാന്നുള്ളതല്ല. റാദർ യു ഫോക്കസ് ഓൺ സർട്ടൻ വിമൻ റൈറ്റേഴ്സ്, their world, their experiences, their correspondences, their communications, their expressions, then you have a newly visible world of female culture. ഈ ഷേർലി ആഡ്നർ ഉണ്ടോ?
ഇല്ല. പിന്നെ before we can even begin to ask.
Okay. സെക്കൻഡ്. അപ്പൊ അതിന്റെ കുറച്ച് പ്രോബ്ലംസ് പറയുകയാണ് ചെയ്തത് ബിഫോർ. ആൻഡ് ഗൈനോക്രിറ്റിക്സിന്റെ എക്സാമ്പിൾ ആയിട്ട് അവർ പറയുന്നത് വർക്ക്സ് ഓഫ് സ്റ്റഡിങ് ദ വർക്ക്സ് ഓഫ് മ്യൂറിയൽ സ്പാർക്ക് ആൻഡ് എലിസബത്ത് ബാരറ്റ് ബ്രൗണിംഗ് ആണ്. ദാറ്റ് യു ക്യാൻ റീഡ് ലേറ്റർ, ബട്ട് യു ക്യാൻ ജസ്റ്റ് maybe note down that studies of certain authors that she mentions as examples of gynocritics. വെർജീനിയ വുൾഫ് ഇവരെ സ്റ്റഡി ചെയ്യുന്നതിനെ പറ്റിയിട്ടൊക്കെയാണ് പറയുന്നത്. And what was the sentence?
Before we can even begin to ask how the literature of women would be different and special.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so I will pause here for the moment because the next section is actually about a certain kind of historicism that she's a certain history of women's writing that she is constructing. She is going to now talk about 3 different phases of women's literary criticism, women's writing and women's criticism, which she calls the feminine, feminist and female phases, but I think we can do that tomorrow. So far we will stop here, and I hope these are the important points that we have been talking about. Really, we've been talking about the two types of why this question of feminist criticism in the first place, and then what are the existing modes of feminist criticism, and what are the limitations with the feminist critique, which was probably the most how do I say, the most prevalent form of feminist criticism at the time that Showalter was writing this essay in the late 1970s, and what she proposes as an alternative for that. Okay, so I will stop here for now, and then if you have some questions or some queries, we can do that. We can discuss that.